I'm Alexia Russell, and today on The Detail, has the left lost its way? In a cost of living crisis, where are the bold plans to help the struggling working class? Who is mobilising the discontented? It's historically been the job of the Labour Party, founded on the back of the union movement to fight for social justice and workers' rights, lifting them from poverty, as described in this probably true story from Monty Python's Four Yorkshiremen.
We used to get up at 3, clean the lake, eat a handful of hot gravel, then we'd work in mill for 20 hours for twopence a month, then we'd come home and Dad would beat us about the head and neck with a broken bottle, if we were lucky.
Well, those days, even if they never quite existed, are gone.
Throughout the 20th century in particular, we did see economic growth, we saw standards of living go up, and that was a problem for the left because the left have traditionally, their whole raison d'etre, their reasons to exist, have been to look after those that are struggling.
This is Dr. Bryce Edwards, the director of the Democracy Project, who describes himself as a non-partisan, non-voter of the left who tries to be a critical thinker. He writes about New Zealand politics and current affairs on his Substack. The title of a recent piece was, "In an Age of Discontent, Where is the Left?" He points out that worldwide, the organisations that traditionally backed left-wing politics, unions, working class communities, cooperatives and clubs, are drying up. The left itself has become middle class. Its activists and MPs have increasingly been university graduates, professionals, public servants, academics.
A lot of people that entered into the Labour Party in the 1970s and 1980s were the sons and daughters of working class people who had been elevated into being able to go to university and become professionals. So yeah, to some extent, it's a result of class mobility. But the problem is that you can have that, and a more successful left-wing party, I think, still retains some sort of organic connection with poorer parts of society rather than just wanting to represent them in sort of a top-down way. And so that hasn't really happened in New Zealand.
I'm also going to be talking to former MP turned political commentator Peter Dunn about the battle for the middle and how people's understanding of fiscal responsibility has moved the dial.
And often that means that a lot of the traditional passion about, we can afford this because it's in the interests of the working people of New Zealand, etc., starts to diminish because people say, yeah, that's all very well, but how are you actually going to pay for it?
But Bryce first, with a bit of background.
Throughout the West and most of the world, we talk about a left-right divide, and we typically have elections and democracy based around a party of the left and a party of the right. And that party of the left normally is associated with the poorer parts of society, the working class, and every country tends to have a sort of a Labour Party, a social democratic party that's based on unions. And so, New Zealand's no exception. The New Zealand Labour Party was formed by the trade unions, and so they wanted a political representation in Parliament of working class New Zealanders because that didn't exist so much before the Labour Party. Over years, the Labour Party's been very successful. They've had numerous governments and have at times been the most popular party in the country. And they've achieved many things in those governments, and obviously that first Labour government in the 1930s, Michael Joseph Savage as Prime Minister, really brought in some radical reforms to New Zealand, introduced basically the welfare state, nationalised industry, introduced healthcare provided by the state, housing, and since then the Labour Party has struggled a bit with how it orientates to its working class support and with the trade unions. And really in the second part of the 20th century, certainly from the 1980s onwards, Labour became less associated in this country and elsewhere, in fact, with working people and with working class. And throughout the world we had this phenomenon whereby parties of the left became a bit more associated with middle-class professions and academics, in fact, and lost some of its connection with working class voters, and we had what is sometimes talked about by political scientists as a class de-alignment, whereby the parties of the left weren't so much getting the votes of the poor and the working class. They were picking up more of the professionals and the middle class, and the parties of the right started to win more of support from poorer areas and working class. And so that's really mixed up politics in this country and elsewhere, and made it a bit harder to see that left-right divide kind of playing out in each election, and just makes politics a bit more confusing, and of course leads to some disenchantment, particularly on the left or in working class communities, that their party, their traditional party, is no longer representing them like they used to. I mean, class politics has declined in countries like New Zealand, and largely because class organisations like trade unions, working associations aren't like they used to be. They've kind of been hollowed out and declined, and so throughout the Western world, unions have been on the decline for the last 50 years, and certainly in New Zealand we used to have very large unions, and about 6 or 7 out of 10 employees used to be members of unions back in the 1970s, 1980s, and that's declined now to around about 20%. And so unions themselves just aren't as healthy as they used to be. And so, I think that has a flow-through effect through to the main party of the left, Labour.
Then in the 1980s, throughout the world, we saw what's now called the neoliberal economic revolution.
Governments introduced deregulation and restructured the economy more in the favour of the wealthy and of business. And whereas in New Zealand it was actually a Labour Party that did that, the fourth Labour government under David Lange and Roger Douglas. And yes, they essentially increased inequality, made it harder for trade unions. And then when the next national government came in of Jim Bolger and Ruth Richardson and Bill Birch, yes, they brought in the Employment Contracts Act, and that really did make it very difficult for unions. And that was the turning point when union membership really went bottomed out. So I don't think unions are quite the bogeyman that they used to be, but nonetheless, we're not seeing the parties of the left re-embrace unions in a way that could give them a bit more of an anchor into working class communities.
On the other hand, the struggle, brothers, is back.
We've certainly seen in the West, and especially in New Zealand, since the global financial crisis of 2008, we have actually seen living standards go down. We've seen real problems with economic growth. We've had lots of intractable crises that affect people at the bottom more than anyone else. So the housing crisis in terms of affordability, obviously the cost of living crisis at the moment, and unemployment. So I'm not sure that trend really does speak to where we're at in 2026. I think there really is an opportunity for the politicians of the left to kind of reconnect with some of those more material issues that used to drive the left, around wages, around inequality, poverty, collective action. And so, because really what we saw from the 1980s and 1990s onwards was the left kind of went away from those traditional economic concerns and got more focused on what you might call cultural or symbolic or even identity politics issues that are important, but they're not the same things as about the redistribution of resources in society.
Labour is in crisis. They actually have figured out everything but how to win. Make your mind up where you stand with Māoridom. Do you sleep with John Tamihere? Are you the proud former party that stood up for blue-collar interests, fairness, empowerment, or have you been completely overtaken by identity politics, trans issues, wokeism, and lost your way?
I think it was Martin Bradbury who said the poor people are not sitting around the kitchen table debating who to cancel for misusing pronouns.
Yeah, so there is that debate. Increasingly on the left, there's a lot of debate around what you might call political correctness or woke politics or policing of, of language. And there's been some important, debates going on there in terms of racism, sexism, sexuality. And I think the likes of Martin Bradbury and many others on the left would say that the pendulum has sort of swung too far in that direction, and that the left has gone from being maybe too focused on wages to being too focused on social issues and, the correct pronouns. And perhaps it's time to rebalance that, and maybe the parties of the left, if they got back to a bit more of a balance, that they would actually do better in elections.
Yeah, well, the reason to exist, as you say, is here now. So why aren't they picking that up and running with it? The youth unemployment rate is horrendous. Why aren't they jumping up and down and saying, we'll do something about this?
Look, that is a puzzle, and there is so much evidence at the moment in New Zealand society that there is discontent, that there is, people that want perhaps a more left-wing populist version of the Labour Party or the Green Party.
Peter Dunn led the United Future Party for 17 years from the year 2000. Described as centrist and moderate, it worked alongside both Labour and National-led coalitions. I asked him if he thought Labour has shifted closer towards the centre.
Well, in part it has, but I think the other reality is that the public has shifted as well. Certainly the baby boom generation and a couple of generations after that have a much more acute sense about where's the money coming from, for instance, than perhaps earlier generations. And one of the things I think that is a legacy of both the fourth Labour government and the following national government is this whole issue about fiscal responsibility, which cuts deep into the national psyche. So I think that's why you see Labour being very cautious in its promising in terms of talking about we've costed everything we know, how we're going to fund it.
Are we more sophisticated now in understanding that things must be paid for?
I think we are, but I think that creates a problem which I don't think the left has quite grappled with. Given that reality, how do you then set out an agenda for social change, which is really what they're all about, which will be costly or expensive, and not frighten the horses when it comes to telling people how you're going to pay for it? And I think that is a challenge that the Labour Party here struggles with. It's also a factor of our country particularly, but not necessarily solely ours, and that is that, to put it bluntly, we don't have enough wealthy people in New Zealand for a redistributive policy to be able to work effectively. The taxpayers at the very top of the tree, while they might be earning large amounts, are actually quite small in number and quite a small percentage of the total taxpaying community. So that saying we'll take from the rich to give to the poor just doesn't quite work because there's not enough of the rich to take from. And I think that tempers a lot of the debate too.
In a way, is Labour stuck between a rock and a hard place? It must be fiscally responsible. It hasn't got a great well of money it can tap into. It's politically feasible or even actually feasible.
I think that's true. I think that's absolutely true. And making the problem worse is it also has potential partners who aren't so constrained. The Greens, for instance, can make big, expensive promises, knowing that they will at best be a support party to the government. They won't be the lead party of government. And similarly to Party Māori, in respect of its own constituency, can be equally expensive. So they can put the ideas out there. The problem that creates for Labour, of course, is it's the party forced to say, yeah, no, it's a good idea, but we can't do that. And that doesn't come across well in public. So it's a real dilemma for them. National has exactly the same problem on the right and how it moderates, particularly ACT. And it'll be interesting to see now where the Opportunity Party fits. I mean, already you're seeing both the major parties pour cold water on some of its policies. So quite how all this comes out in the mix and Labour on the left maintains its sort of spiritual integrity is going to be a very interesting question.
Yeah, because we are still in the middle of a cost of living crisis. Isn't this the moment to seize, to sort of actually go back to some of those roots and say, here is the help for the working person?
Well, I think if you look around the world, that's probably the correct answer. But the challenge then is, assuming you can identify the solutions, how do you fund them? And how do you not compound the debt problem that countries seem to be struggling with. Having said that, we have one of the lower debt to GDP ratios, so there was a little bit of scope there, but we also have one of the smaller economies, so you've got to balance that out as well. And I think the problem has been that the sort of the heart of the left understands what it wants to say, but the head keeps saying, oh, just hang on, you can't actually do that. And they haven't quite worked out yet where the balance is between the two.
Is it time to be brave about it, though?
Well, it's difficult to say. I mean, you can look at the British example. The Labour Party in Britain, particularly under, in the 80s under Michael Foot and more latterly under Jeremy Corbyn, was brave and bold and unelectable. That's the challenge. The Labour Party here could choose to be brave and bold and make a great statement, but it may well prove to be unelectable as a consequence.
Doesn't that make it hard for the voter? It's either I'm sick of these guys and I'll try the other guys, but there's really not much to differentiate them.
That's the dilemma, and that's, I think, why the support for the two main parties is declining at 61% in the latest RNZ poll. It's probably the lowest it's been between the two of them for about the last, certainly since MMP came in. And neither of the major parties shows any signs of understanding quite how to address that problem. And so consequently, you get a sort of a reverse thing happen because they can't strengthen their appeal to their traditional core. They shed voters to the fringes, ACT or the Greens or Opportunity or whoever, and they always look better and bolder than the major party. So it's a sort of a circular argument in a way.
Once upon a time, Labour's ranks were filled by ex-unionists or people who'd worked in mines or on the railways at the wharves. We are now in the time of the professional politician.
I think that's a really big part of the issue, actually. You look at when Helen Clark became Prime Minister in 2008, she took 3 young people into her office as they were more than interns, but they were young staffers. One was called Jacinda Ardern, the other was called Chris Hipkins, and the other was called Grant Robertson. So 2 prime ministers and a finance minister later. But their life experience was probably questionable. And I think that's part of Labour's problem in a way that it's been dominated over recent years by the party apparatchiks who've come up through the system and also by urban professionals. And a lot of those working class voters, the solid blokes from the freezing works or the wharves or those sort of traditional Labour figures have been pushed into the background. Now, some have just sort of stayed within the Labour ranks. I mean, I think Craig Rennie, the candidate for Wellington Bays, coming up through the trade unions is an obvious example. Others have drifted off to perhaps more extreme versions like the Greens or even to Party Māori in some cases. But Labour has lost that heart because the new group of people coming through who are very much process-driven and policy outcome focused rather than passion-focused have taken over. It's been a long-term change and it's been in vogue in both parties. And I think I look back at the last few governments and think that there are 3 critical people in a way that we don't have around on either side at the moment. A Bill Birch, a Michael Cullen, or a Stephen Joyce. They were in their respective governments, not only the ministers of finance, but also the why ministers, who questioned everything. Why are we doing this? How does this fit with our basic policy? They were they weren't quite the conscience, but they were the in-house critic. And I don't think we've got that anymore and either side. And so there's no sort of keep your foot on the ground mentality there. It's full steam ahead and let's do what we can in our 3 years because we mightn't get re-elected. And that's a very dangerous sort of way on which to build a foundation for future change, because what it means is everything's very short term and everything's liable to be turned over if there's a change of government.
Bryce Edwards discussed these concepts in a speech to the Fabian Society in Wellington last week. The topic was left-wing populism.
Populism as a sort of political science category is something where a stress is put on campaigning in favour of the ordinary people against the elite. And so populists, tend to rally, the majority of the public and say that there's a elite that is corrupt or it's not running the country properly. And so populists of the right they tend to add in some nationalism and some authoritarianism, and they don't just blame, the economic elite, but they tend to blame immigrants, welfare beneficiaries, outsiders, whereas left-wing populists, They are focused on the elite, but more just at the economic elite. So they focus on, the banks, the supermarket duopoly, the lobbyists, the professional politicians, and generally the property owners. And so that's the difference between left-wing populism and right-wing populists. So I'm not sure if there's anyone in New Zealand that calls themselves a left-wing populist, but you can see that there's some sort of, I think, demand at the moment for a more rigorous, robust sort of pushback against, whether it's the supermarket owners or banks or electricity companies, insurance companies, that I'm not sure the left are kind of connecting with. So that's the puzzle.
Bryce says Labour's small target tactic this election is a reaction to previous elections where it produced large manifestos. That didn't work for them, so they're promising less with a plan to over-deliver.
They need to somehow reduce the negatives and accentuate the positives. And I think Chris Hipkins does that very well, and he's a very good performer. He knows politics inside out. He gives good speeches. He's very good in debates. But there's something maybe lacking there for people that want some more substantial politics and wants to see a Labour Party that is entirely different to the current government.
But it's very self-serving, isn't it? I mean, what they're saying is, we're not really going to tell you what we'll get up to. You probably know what we'll get up to. Just trust us. Just vote for us.
Yeah, and I think that is a problem. I mean, they could argue that they will be more competent than the current government and that they will be more caring, more generous. But I think there's a demand to see some more actual policies and some real big differences.
The complicator at the moment is the cost of living crisis. People are genuinely struggling in so many different areas, whether it be paying the rates bill or the water charges bill or the cost of living or whatever it is. And what they're looking for fundamentally is some relief in those areas before we start to talk about the broader issues of health, education, social cohesion, etc. And I think that the problem they've got is that none of the parties is really talking to those particular specific problems. And it's all very well to be worried about what the Straits of Hormuz is doing to international oil flows, etc., when you're struggling to put food on the table.
It's definitely their bread and butter, and they're not making the most of it. And to me, that's a huge missed opportunity. And it's very hard to explain. And I come across a lot of other people that are scratching their heads over why Labour aren't focused more on these things, that why they aren't going after the banks, the supermarkets, etc., and those with power. And of course, one explanation is simply that the Labour Party, like parliamentarians in general, don't really sometimes get the visceral feelings of the public because they're too detached from the daily life of everyday working New Zealanders. They have good parliamentary salaries. They have, just about every MP owns a house and sometimes 7. They don't have the same problems with paying bills and worrying about the cost of living that ordinary New Zealanders do. So it might just simply be that the Labour Party's become too middle class. It's become too socially or economically privileged, and it therefore doesn't have that same fight like we had with the first Labour government, when you had politicians that had risen up from the factory floor and through trade unions, and they implemented these big policies that totally changed the economy and society and kind of rebalanced things in favour of poorer people and working people. Maybe it's just a different type of Labour Party now that just can't make those same connections.
That's it for today. The Details, a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. This episode was produced by Gwen McClure and engineered by Phil Bench. Thanks to Bryce Edwards and Peter Dunn. I'm Alexia Russell. Ka kite.